translation, but I assume you just asked me to start.
Yes, so there's a little globe, I believe, at the bottom of the screen, and you choose the language that you wish to listen in.
I think we have it. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Go ahead. You have 5 minutes.
Very good. Before I begin, on behalf of those of us in Calgary today, I'd like to acknowledge the ancestral territory of the people of the Treaty 7 region and also the home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. While this short statement is quick and easy to make, it will take the dedicated work of all of us to make reconciliation a reality. With that, I'd like to start my comments. As an oil and gas executive with 40 years experience, I could praise the transformational virtues of hydrocarbons over the past century, convey the world's dependence on oil and gas for decades to come, recite economic contributions to Canada's prosperity, and yes, discuss the concerning effects of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. I can speak to these topics with knowledge and conviction. However, today I plan to dispel a series of myths and paint a picture of opportunity. Myth number one, oil and gas prosperity comes at the expense of the planet. I believe this is false. Profits and the planet are not mutually exclusive, they're mutually dependent. The energy transition will take expertise, technology, and funding. Expertise in project planning and execution, which exists in the oil and gas sector. Technology, which has been a hallmark of our industry since the early days of Spindletop, or in Canada's case, Leduc, and funding from a financially strong industry coupled with government support. Myth number two, Canadian energy companies are doing little on their own, but rather resisting the energy transition and decarbonization. I believe this is also false. Canadian companies are among the world's most committed and proactive in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, literally putting our monies where our mouths are. The companies here today, including Suncor, are spending hundreds of millions of dollars funding fuel switching and low carbon power generation projects, making investments in energy efficiency, building and operating renewable fuels plants, piloting technologies to lower emissions from in situ extraction, and collaborating to advance a globally unprecedented carbon capture and sequestration opportunity, the Oil Sands Pathways Alliance. Myth number three, Canada can demonstrate global leadership by restricting its oil and gas sector for the benefit of the planet. This is perhaps the most concerning falsehood. The world will not consume one less barrel of oil simply because Canada chooses not to provide it. That barrel will come from somewhere else, in most cases somewhere with less commitment to responsible development, democratic ideals, social accountability, and climate action. How do I know? I've worked in many of the countries that hold the lion's share of the world's remaining reserves. Now the opportunity. Canada is blessed with an abundance of oil and gas, number 4 globally in oil reserves, an amount Canadians couldn't consume in more than 100 years. Hence the opportunity to provide abundant, affordable, and responsibly produced energy with lower emissions to people around the world, including allies increasingly concerned about energy security, and also to millions of others who require energy to achieve a quality of life we take for granted. We can improve people's lives, increase Canada's prosperity, and help tackle climate change, a winning proposition. However, industry cannot unconditionally and unilaterally decarbonize Canada's oil and gas sector if, as a result, no one wants to invest in us or invest in Canada. It will take collaboration to create a stronger, safer, healthier, and more prosperous world with Canada as a leader in it. Industry by developing technology and investing in projects, government by developing sound public policy and the enabling regulatory framework. Sadly, neither the requisite policies or regulatory framework exist today in Canada. Throughout history, Canada has punched above its weight around the world, whether it was 80 years ago today on D-Day, with the landing at Normandy on Juno Beach, or sitting at the table shaping today's international climate accords. Canada has always been on the right side of history and has yet another opportunity to be there today. Canadians expect more from their political and business leaders than pointing fingers and clinging to ideology. They expect their leaders to roll up their sleeves and work together to address issues, tackle challenges, and capture opportunities. Issues and opportunities that will determine their grandchildren's long-term health and prosperity. If that is what this committee wants to do, I'm all in, and Suncor is all in.
Great.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Right on time. Mr. Corson, you have 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. In this meeting today and every day that Imperial carries out our business across the country, we do so on the traditional territories of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, who have lived on and cared for these lands for centuries. I and Imperial come here today fully committed to our reconciliation journey. Imperial produces oil and gas and manufactures petroleum products that are essential to Canada's energy security needs and vital to improving the standard of living for all Canadians, while significantly benefiting the Canadian economy in the form of job creation and supporting federal and provincial treasuries with substantial tax and royalty revenues. Recent years have highlighted the importance of both doing our part to provide energy supply security and taking action to reduce emissions in support of a net zero future while growing value for our shareholders and other stakeholders. Imperial has worked diligently on emission reduction roadmaps and business plans to lower greenhouse gas intensity in our operations and provide lower life cycle emission product solutions to our customers. Our decarbonization strategy includes lowering intensity and absolute emissions at our upstream and downstream assets, lowering the emissions intensity of our products for our customers, and launching a low carbon solutions business to help others decarbonize in hard to abate sectors. I'm pleased to share that Imperial has implemented a company-wide goal to achieve net zero Scope 1 and 2 emissions from operated assets by 2050 through technology advancements and collaboration with government and our industry partners. Building on Imperial's previous success of reducing greenhouse gas intensity in our operated oil sands facilities by more than 20% between 2013 and 2016, Imperial aims to further reduce the greenhouse gas intensity of these assets by 30% compared with 2016 levels by the end of 2030. I'm pleased to note that we've already achieved approximately a 10% reduction in year-end greenhouse gas emissions intensity compared to 2016. The company is making significant progress and plans to achieve this reduction through many initiatives, including energy efficiency improvements, next-generation solvent technologies at our Cold Lake operation, using renewable diesel in our mining fleet at Kearl, and carbon capture and storage as part of our collaboration with the Pathways Alliance. Last month, we started production at our Grand Rapids project at Cold Lake using technology expected to reduce greenhouse gas emissions intensity up to 40% compared to traditional methods. We are also piloting other technologies that could reduce greenhouse gas emissions intensity by up to 90% over traditional recovery methods. Right now, we are building Canada's largest renewable diesel project at our Strathcona refinery in Edmonton, which starting next year will produce more than 1 billion liters of renewable diesel annually from locally sourced agricultural feedstocks. This renewable diesel will help reduce emissions for our customers by about 3 million metric tons per year. We are investing $720 million in this facility, which has created 600 construction jobs and could be foundational for creating a low-carbon hydrogen value chain in Alberta. Imperial is also exploring the potential for lithium from brine extraction with an eye to create a domestic supply chain of a key critical mineral for use in EV batteries. We have also tested bio-based co-processing at our refineries to deliver carbon intensity reductions in our finished products. For greater detail on these initiatives, Imperial has shared our latest Advancing Climate Solutions report with the committee. Over Imperial's 140-plus year history, some business fundamentals have not changed. The investments we make are long-term, and we operate in a global market that is subject to the cyclical nature of commodity prices. This cycle results in good years, including 2022, which was our most profitable. But that followed 2020, which was our least profitable, when Imperial reported a net loss of over $1.8 billion. Through it all, though,
Sorry,
Imperial
Mr.
has
Corson.
steadfastly-
Mr. Corson, I have to stop you there. We're over 5 minutes, but there'll be ample opportunity to advance your points in response to questions. We'll go now to Mr. McKenzie of Cenovus.
Great, and thank you, Mr. Chair. We appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today about the work our industry is doing to help Canada meet its climate goals, while ensuring Canadians continue to enjoy a strong economy, long-term access to affordable energy, and in this increasingly unstable geopolitical environment, energy security. Cenovus is one of Canada's largest energy producers, providing well-paying jobs to about 8,500 staff. And Cenovus has been clear. We share the world's concerns about climate change. Oil and gas production contributes more than a quarter of Canada's total GHG emissions, and our industry needs to be a big part of the solution. And that's why we're a proud member of the Pathways Alliance. With expected co-investment from governments, we and our Pathways partner companies have proposed to invest over $24 billion in emission reduction projects by the end of this decade. And that's primarily for shared carbon capture and storage network, as well as individual company projects that would feed into it. Mr. Chair, we see an important role for our industry in helping secure a sustainable future for Canadians as the world transitions to a lower carbon economy. And that means reducing emissions. It also means keeping our industry strong and globally competitive for decades so that we can continue to make outsized contributions to Canada's prosperity. As you know, ours is a highly cyclical industry, and our fortunes rise and fall with the prices of natural gas and oil. In 2022, for example, oil and gas companies paid reported a net income of just over $63 billion. In that same year, though, our industry paid about $50 billion in royalties and taxes. Now compare that to 2020, when the oil prices turned negative. Our industry reported net losses of over $45 billion. There were no income taxes paid by our sector that year and less than $5 billion in royalties. So finally, look at the results from trough to peak. Over those 3 years in aggregate, our industry reported total net income of about $53 billion. We paid 1.5 times that much in royalties and taxes, almost $80 billion. And that money helps pay for jobs, hospitals, education, social programs, and other things that contribute to Canada's high standard of living. Mr. Chair, a strong oil and gas sector is good for Canadians. We create hundreds of thousands of direct and indirect jobs and reinvest billions of dollars into Canada's economy, making our industry one of the largest investors in the country. Without oil and gas exports, the Canadian dollar would be weaker, increasing the cost of everything Canadians buy. Our industry also makes significant contributions to Indigenous communities and is one of the largest employers of Indigenous Canadians. Our energy sector is a strategic advantage for Canada and in an increasingly unstable world. Today, as the world's energy mix diversifies, every credible study shows that we will continue to need all forms of energy, including oil, to help meet the world's growing energy demand. That oil will be produced somewhere, and it should be produced in Canada, where we have some of the world's strongest regulations and industry-leading ESG performance. Mr. Chair, reducing carbon emissions is critical. And over the last 3 years, we and our industry partners have progressed multiple feasibility studies, engineering designs, environment plans, and started filing regulatory applications, and we've been advancing work on other technologies. But before we can put shovels in the ground, we need many government permits and approvals, and we need regulatory certainty and co-investment commitments. In short, Mr. Chair, a strong oil and gas industry gives Canada access to secure supplies of energy on an affordable basis, supports our dollar, and helps drive our economy. Today, Canada faces a productivity crisis, declining GDP per capita, and low business investment. A strong oil and gas industry can help get our economy back on track while we advance our work to reduce emissions. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to take your questions.
Merci, Monsieur McKenzie. On se tourne.
Thank you, Mr. McKenzie. Now on to Shell. Ms. Pierce, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to participate today. I want to first acknowledge that as I'm in Toronto, I'm on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I am very grateful to be healthy and in good spirits, and I hope you are too. Today's topic is at the core of Shell's strategy, which supports our purpose to provide more and cleaner energy solutions as we work to become a net zero emissions energy business by 2050. Shell Canada Limited has operated in Canada for over 100 years. We are an integrated energy company offering products and services ranging from aviation fuels to sulfur and EV charging. We operate fuel refining and chemicals facilities near Fort Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Sarnia, Ontario, and have nearly 1,500 branded mobility stations across Canada. Shell Canada also produces shale gas and liquids in Alberta and BC, and is a joint venture participant in LNG Canada. We're also proud of our advancements in carbon capture and storage, or CCS, and low-carbon fuels. There's no question the global energy system is in transition, and so is Shell. The pace of our own transition will be guided by how fast we can adapt our businesses and will depend on external factors, such as progressive government policy and customer choice. We believe our strategy will transform Shell into a net zero emissions energy business, creating value for our shareholders, customers, and wider society. However, our operating plans can't reflect our 2050 target yet, as this is outside our 10-year planning period. However, in the future, as society moves towards net zero emissions, we expect Shell's operating plans to reflect this movement. If society as a whole doesn't get to net zero in the same time frame, however, there's a significant risk that Shell may not meet its target. We recognize the importance of Canada's climate targets and the need for society, including companies like ours, to play a role. Shell Canada has joined the federal government's Net Zero Challenge, which recognizes businesses developing and implementing credible net zero emissions plans. Shell has laid out short and medium-term climate targets in support of our net zero emissions by 2050 target. These targets are complemented by the ambition to help address Scope 3 emissions, which come from customers' use of the oil products we sell. This means we are working to reduce our own emissions and shift our product offering towards low and zero carbon products. Already, we are making good progress. Globally, by the end of 2023, we'd achieved more than 60% of our target to halve Scope 1 and 2 emissions from our operations by 2030, compared with 2016. Shell Canada is well positioned to deliver on our strategy here in Canada. We are decarbonizing our operations, for instance, through reducing methane emissions and incorporating renewable power, such as hydro, solar, and wind power, and CCS. Increasingly, we are also investing to increase the supply of low-carbon fuels and rolling out EV charging across the nation in partnership with governments and communities. We are also contemplating other investments, including a large-scale CCS project in Alberta. Decarbonization projects must be investable. We believe society will not achieve the needed scale of emissions reductions if projects are highly reliant on government funding alone. Instead, companies need to develop business models that are plausible, profitable, and can unleash private capital while working closely with governments. It's worth noting that last year, roughly 8% of Shell's global investment was in Canada. The majority of the spend was on the LNG Canada project, which will use natural gas and renewable electricity to reduce emissions from the plant by more than 1/3 compared with the world's best-performing facility when it starts up. LNG Canada is the largest private sector investment in Canadian history and a once-in-a-generation opportunity for First Nations, local communities, and provincial and national economies. Shell supports a balanced energy transition, one in which the world achieves net zero emissions while still providing a secure and affordable supply of energy today. To help manage affordability for all Canadians, it's vital we don't dismantle the current energy system faster than we can build the clean energy system of the future. By working together with effective government policies, we can help shift consumer demand to low carbon products and develop the infrastructure and technology needed for the energy transition. Shell's ability to raise and invest capital through the energy transition depends on delivering strong shareholder returns. Governments and taxpayers can't and shouldn't fund the transition alone. If projects don't offer attractive returns, capital won't be invested. In closing, Shell has a clear strategy to become a net zero emissions energy business by 2050 and has set clear targets to measure our progress. By making decarbonization projects investable, we can unleash further clean energy investment, which will ultimately benefit all Canadians. I look forward to the discussions today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Madame Pierce. On se tourne maintenant vers Madame Haradance.
Thank you very much. Now we will move on to Ms. Harridance from Enbridge.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. I'm Michelle Harridance, EVP and President of Enbridge's gas distribution and storage business. We acknowledge that our projects and operations span treaty and tribal lands, the national Métis homeland, unceded lands, and the traditional territories of Indigenous nations, tribes, governments, and groups across Turtle Island. As such, we have a responsibility to preserve and care for the land, learn from her original inhabitants, and move forward together in the spirit of healing, reconciliation, and partnership. And in the spirit of reconciliation, I want to thank all parliamentarians for the important step this spring towards a national loan guarantee program. Following on the success of our own Project Rocket, where 23 communities purchased an equity position in our Athabasca system thanks to the Alberta program, we believe the national loan guarantee is a critical step to open up more opportunities for Indigenous communities to fully participate in Canada's economy. Building on my co-panelist presentations, which represent the perspectives of upstream producers, I'll focus today on the critical role of natural gas in delivering safe, reliable, affordable, and sustainable energy to millions of homes and businesses in Canada and beyond. Enbridge recently celebrated our 75th anniversary, and here our Ontario utility has been operating for over 175 years. Over that time, we've evolved to meet society's changing energy needs while contributing to Canada's economic development and quality of life. Today, our gas distribution and storage business serves 4 million customers in Quebec and Ontario, including rural, northern, and Indigenous communities. And with our recent U.S. acquisitions, we'll soon be the largest natural gas utility in North America. We're North America's leading energy infrastructure company for oil and natural gas, moving resources from production to demand centers across the continent and around the world, and we're one of the largest renewable companies on the continent. We also deliver benefits for Canada. In 2023, Enbridge invested over $2.5 billion in capital and spent over $3.6 billion on operations across Canada. We contributed over $3.15 billion in property tax, corporate tax, and other taxes. And we firmly believe natural gas has a key role in our energy future. In fact, the IEA predicts that the path to net zero will involve diverse energy sources that will shift over the decades. Natural gas is a highly reliable energy source and remains a cost-effective energy source for consumers, at about half the cost of oil or propane and about 50% cheaper than electric baseboard heating. Natural gas pairs well with renewable energy. When the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, or in cold snaps and heat waves, natural gas is quick and easily dispatchable to meet peak demand. A 24/7 economy requires 24/7 power, and as energy demand rises, all sources will be needed to meet it. For heavy industries like steel, chemicals, and cement, natural gas is a critical feedstock and a fuel for the manufacturing process. In the future, these sectors may well be supported further by lower carbon options like renewable natural gas, carbon capture and storage, and eventually hydrogen. And while, of course, electricity will have a vital role in the future energy mix, it's inextricably linked to natural gas. For instance, consider the growing power demands for data centers and AI. Clean tech, EV plants, and critical minerals, which have been enticed by federal incentives, also create more energy demand. We believe industry has a key role to play in reducing emissions related to natural gas. Enbridge is a signatory to the One Future Coalition, a group of over 55 gas companies aiming to reduce methane emissions intensity to below 1%. To get there, we're investing in modernizing our systems. We're innovating to manage methane emissions. And in 2023, we reported a 20% reduction in absolute emissions from 2018 levels and a 40% reduction in our methane emissions. We're encouraged by these results and focused on reaching our 2050 net zero target. As we look to ensure Canada's investment in its natural gas infrastructure remains used and useful, we're investing in low carbon fuels that can be blended with natural gas. In Ontario, we're involved in a biogas facility that's turning organic waste into RNG, fueling Ontario's first carbon negative bus in the city of Hamilton. We also launched just north of me here, North America's first hydrogen blending project, which serves over 4,000 residential customers in Markham and which has lots of potential to grow. Finally, Canadian LNG is providing energy security in Europe and Asia and helping reduce global emissions by replacing coal-fired generation. Canada must look beyond our borders and the 1.5% of global emissions we produce to deliver our reliable, affordable, and responsibly produced natural gas to our allies and partners. Now, I thank you, and I certainly welcome your questions.
Merci beaucoup à tous et à toutes.
Thank you to everyone. Before beginning, Ms. Pierce, can you please just raise the boom of your mic a little bit under your nose for the interpreters? Thank you. So on to Ms. Stubbs. She will start the first round with 6 minutes.
Thank you, witnesses. Agree with everything just said about LNG. And of course, LNG Canada was previously approved by the federal Conservative government, then deliberately delayed and risked by the government who froze all the applications, put that project under review again unnecessarily, and then gave it the stamp of approval. Just because of the subject of the motion, I'm going to concentrate on upstream oil sands producers, but invite all of the other CEOs to follow up to any questions I ask or subjects you want to expand on in written commentary, which must be included in a final report from this committee. I just want to ask a very quick question, a yes or no question, to Mr. Kruger, Mr. Corson, and Mr. McKenzie quickly. Recently, a statement was made that after 40 years, your companies have done very little to combat climate change. Now, the three conservative colleagues at this table here, we represent the workers, the Indigenous workers, employers, contractors, and communities in which all of your companies operate. That was certainly shocking to us and not near what we see in our own backyard. Quickly, yes or no, does that statement reflect your position and the position of your company?
Yeah, one has to turn the mic on. I think somebody's witness is on mute. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I said I'll start. That does not represent our position, Suncor's position.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would concur with that. That doesn't represent Cenovus's position either.
Okay.
And nor does that represent Imperial's position.
Okay, thank you. So to the three of you, which country, or sorry, just starting with Mr. Kruger and also just for time, you know that we've got very limited here. What country is the top competitor for energy investment in Canada?
Well, right now you'd like, well, one, capital is it's global, but right now you would say we compete for investment capital with the United States, perhaps more than anywhere else today.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. If you look at the top 10 producing countries, Canada being 4 in most circumstances, sometimes 5, it is the U.S. that we compete largely for capital with.
I would agree as well.
Then will you comment, which country is it easier to get things built in, the United States or Canada? And how does Canada's regulatory and fiscal framework compare to the United States and also to other major energy producing countries around the world? Where certainly I know, Mr. Kruger, you have lots of experience.
Well, Shannon, you asked a direct question. I'll give you a direct answer. From a regulatory policy standpoint, it's much more difficult to get things done in Canada. We've got a level of complexity, a level of layering, a overlapping of policies that make it longer time and more cost to plan and execute energy projects than the United States.
Yeah, and I'd suggest the same. We don't have as much or as many assets in the U.S. as other companies might have. So I can't speak specifically on a state-by-state basis, for example, but I would suggest it's becoming increasingly difficult to get projects through the regulatory process in Canada.
invite again further details and written follow-up on these questions. So to the upstream oil sands developers who have operated for decades, hasn't always been your understanding that upstream oil sands development is provincial jurisdiction?
I'll go ahead again. I think, you know, the resource certainly is owned by the province, and the vast majority of the permits and approvals we need and seek are from the province, unless it gets to some, there are some select issues with water and things that require national approvals.
Yeah, and I would agree with that.
Yeah, nothing to add.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, Mr. Corson. Do you?
Just one moment. If you're not, could the witnesses who, when a witness is not speaking, we ask that you put yourself on mute if that's possible. Sure. Thank you.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Ms. Stubbs.
To each of you, do you intend to grow your oil sands production and specifically Canada's oil exports?
Well, I can start. Certainly that is our objective. We have been growing our production, and we see there continues to be a global market for our products, and we think Canada can play a very important role that brings significant economic benefits to this country. So yes, our objective is to economically and responsibly grow production.
Maybe.
Yeah, and
ahead, John.
Cenovus is the same. We're currently growing our oil sands production by about 70,000 barrels a day over the next 3 to 4 years. What I would say is we're one of the major shippers on the TMX pipeline, which gives us egress and access to global pricing for our products. But without that egress, I'm not sure that would happen. I think one of the two issues that we have in Alberta in growing our oil sands production is solving for carbon, which we need to do, and ultimately solving for egress as well. And both of those fall within the regulatory framework that you referred to in your prior questions.
Merci. C'est maintenant au tour de Monsieur Vancouveren.
Now on to Mr. Vancouveren.
The witnesses for joining us here. I can tell you that I've never seen the room this full, so there's considerable interest in this discussion. So thank you very much for joining us virtually. I'm going to focus all of my questions on oil sands, and my questions will be directed to you, Mr. Kruger, if that's okay. I'm just trying to find my camera. It's just over there so I can speak directly to you. Just over there. Thank you very much again for joining us. Now, I've got a couple of graphs here, and the first graph is a change in Canada's oil and gas sector greenhouse gas emissions since 2005. And I'm hoping that with the camera you'll be able to see this. The dark blue line represents the increase from oil sands production. You'll notice that it has gone up about 40%, and 40% of all oil and gas emissions are from the oil sands, and they represent about 87 megatons in emissions. For reference, Canada's emissions sit at around 708 megatons, so that's
Mr.
a very considerable.
I'm told the same rules apply in committee as in the House with regards to props.
Okay. Well, there's no other way that I can share this graph, but as everybody can see, this the oil and gas emissions have gone up quite dramatically. Mr. Kruger, are you familiar with this? Are you familiar with the 87 megaton contribution just from the oil sands in Canada to Canada's overall emissions?
I'm not familiar with the graph. It wasn't legible to me, but I am familiar with generally emissions increase as it's related to production increase with Canada's growing share of the world's oil markets.
Okay, I'm glad that you referenced the total production going up, because that's very true. What's also gone up is the individual emissions intensity per barrel. I have another graph here. I won't hold it up. It indicates a 9% increase in the emissions intensity per barrel of oil in Canada. Do you agree that the emissions intensity per barrel of crude oil in the oil sands has gone up as a result of, longer distances, access to mines and processing facilities?
I can't speak to the oil sands overall, but I'm looking at a comparable chart for our company where I would say it's been essentially flat over the last 5 years from an intensity standpoint.
Okay, well, my graph goes back a lot farther than that, to 2004, and what I see is more than a 10% increase in emissions intensity per barrel of crude from the oil sands. Now, here I have a comparison of the emissions intensity per barrel, kilograms per CO2 per barrel of various types of oil and gas. And like I said, I'm focusing on the oil sands here. The oil sands have an average emissions intensity of about 174 kilograms per CO2, whereas U.S. Bakken with no flare is around 24 kilograms per CO2. Mexico Cantorell is around 40. Even U.S. Alaska North Slope is just over 174 kilograms of CO2 per barrel of oil. And like I said, that's been going up over the last 20 years or so. 174 kilograms of CO2 in emissions per barrel. And that's, again, emissions intensity per barrel in the oil sands. This is just extraction and processing emissions before it's even used. So when people, particularly, I've heard it a couple of times today, but conservative politicians regularly say that Canada needs more oil and gas. You know what? I tend to agree. If we can produce it more ethically and with a lower carbon intensity, then certainly. But have we demonstrated an ability to reduce the carbon emissions per barrel of bitumen extraction in the oil sands? Because everything that I'm reading here indicates that it's upwards of 7 times more oil intensive than oil elsewhere. So where's the rationale for Canada oil sands being way less carbon intensive? It seems like it's the opposite of what's true.
Well, again, I don't have the benefit of the data and charts you're looking at. Had they been shared ahead of time, might have been able to more directly comment then. But I would say generally, and I know 3 companies represented on this call today have invested tens of billions of dollars in new generation mining that has essentially produces a barrel that is an equivalent of a barrel refined in the U.S. today. We've done that at Fort Hills, and I'll let my other colleagues speak, but it's called paraffinic froth treatment. It is a technology that has been developed in Canada that allows Canadian barrels to be competitive on the world scale. I'll add one other quick one. One of my colleagues also mentioned what they're doing with in situ technologies to introduce solvents that dramatically reduce the carbon intensity. I think therein lies the answer that Canadians, when given the opportunity, their technology, their ingenuity, can achieve the climate objectives and benefit Canada and Canadians at the same time.
And sure, Mr. Kruger, I would tend to agree with you that it's possible, but it hasn't been demonstrated yet because, like I said, Canada's oil sands per barrel emissions are 7 times higher than an alternative. So when people say that we should be lowering the emissions of the oil and gas production average around the world by increasing emissions from our oil sands, it just doesn't add up. There's more emissions per barrel from our oil sands production than literally any type of oil or gas around the world. So again, I'll read your quote precisely. It says, "The world will not consume 1 less barrel of oil simply because Canada chooses not to provide it. That barrel will come from somewhere else, and in most cases, somewhere with less commitment to responsible development and climate action." Mr. Kruger, it's demonstrated right here that Canada oil sands bitumen is the highest emissions product on the market today. Is it going to go down? Is it going to get towards, U.S. Bakken? Can we get it under 100 kilograms of CO2 per barrel?
A very brief response, please.
Well, I think the answer is if by working together, we talked about the Pathways Alliance, for example, there are major opportunities to do that. And when we do that, the world benefits, Canadians benefit, and Canadian industries benefit. So yeah, I'm a believer that the answer to that's yes.
Well, Canadians are relying on you. I really hope we can get oil sands emissions down.
Merci. On va passer.
Now on to Ms. Posey. Thank you for being among us today. I do have questions, but first I would like to give a statement because there's a lot of things that need to be said. The subject of this meeting is on the profits of your companies. I'll remind you that your activities cause the highest levels of CO2 emissions in Canada and even in the world, as Mr. Van Koevoeten just highlighted. We of course, interested in the sums of around $39 billion a year, but we're also interested in hearing about your efforts to reduce emissions, which is proving to be a major challenge since you're all in favor of increasing your production, despite Canada's commitments to reduce its emissions with the Paris Agreement. Through your lobbying organization, so the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers or the Pathways Alliance, you've managed to convince the federal government to allocate tens of billions of dollars in tax credits for carbon capture and storage projects. And of course, there are many more, but I won't mention them. This technology will in no way contribute to reduce your emissions. and I will get back to that later. This is the Environment Committee. The recent revelations obtained by journalist Karl Mayer's investigation, published on May 27, very recently in the Narwhal, are nauseating. In addition to coming to beg for public funds while your pockets are still lined through the Pathways Alliance, you have asked for the assurance that your carbon capture and storage projects will not be subjected to federal review under the Impact Assessment Act. This request is shocking to me when there's a climate crisis, and I think it's shameless. In order to make such demand, the Alliance must have an unwavering and unshakable confidence and certainty that the industry has a stronghold over the political system. The Alliance's exchanges with 4 ministers, which are reported in this recent article, date back to January 2023 and make clear demands that read more or less like a carbon copy, making a little pun there to lighten the atmosphere and the mood. But these are carbon copies, or a carbon copy likely, of the measures you obtained in the last budgets. The other demands, not yet included in the federal budget, may be included in a future budget, since, it has to be said, Pathways Alliance is certainly very keen. In 2020, Shell Canada announced that its Quest project had captured 5 megatons of CO2 in 5 years. Many of the organizations that wrongly maintain that carbon capture and storage technology is the missing link in decarbonizing the oil and gas sector are using this data to indoctrinate the government a little more towards the CCS technologies, despite its failures. Because yes, after verification, research and evaluation have shown that Quest has actually emitted more CO2 than it has captured. I'll get back to that as well, but I'd rather tell you now. Your claim that carbon capture and storage will save us, I don't believe it, and I'll get back to that later. I'll remind you that Capital Power Corp terminated the Genesee project located west of Edmonton last May, which is very recently, and I quote its CEO, Avik Dey. After carefully reviewing the project, we have concluded that the project does not meet the risk and return thresholds we have set for ourselves, and we ended it. Bloomberg estimated, for facilities that are in operation, that the cost of capture corresponded to $600 per ton. Hundreds of experts and credible organizations around the world, and even people from your own industry, and those who don't want to greenwash, keep repeating, if the technology isn't ready after 5 years of development, it's better to move on to something else. But it's been over 15 years that we've been talking about carbon capture and storage, and you have highlighted it in order to rake in the money. The bottom line is that we need to significantly reduce the balance sheet of your sector, period. Data published by the Canadian Petroleum Products Association Producers Association earlier this year confirmed that the sector's investment will reach over $40 billion by 2024, and that these sums will not go towards decarbonizing measures, but rather towards increasing production and exploitation, or extraction rather, with no other ambition than to maximize your profits. You're not even capable of devoting the equivalent of a year's profits to the climate transition, to transforming your workers' skills towards renewable energies. You're lining your shareholders' pockets with taxpayer money. The money of Quebecers and taxpayers should be used to slow down and to plan our exit from our dependence on fossil fuels, which is what various organizations, the International Energy Agency, are calling for. So here is my question. Ecosystems are suffering, human health is afflicted, and so are human rights. The Senate has just completed a 2-year study. Why are you siphoning public funds if you just want to continue with business as usual? And where is your sense of responsibility? And how are we supposed to want to make you partners in this transition? Ms. Posé, the question will have to wait. Your time is up. On to Ms. Collins. Maybe you will ask for the answer to Ms. Posé's question. The floor is yours, Ms. Collins.
Mr. Chair, my first question is for Mr. Kruger, and you have been making record-breaking profits. You know, the oil sector, oil and gas companies, raked in $63 billion in 2022 alone. You know, the CEOs around the virtual table today make millions in salary and bonuses. You personally made $36.8 million in your first year as CEO. I was just doing a quick calculation with the median income of someone in my community. That would take them about 640 years to make. So in that same year, in that same first year, you also laid off 1,500 workers. And we asked Canadians to send us questions that they wanted us to ask the oil and gas CEOs. And the question that came up the most often was, how do you sleep at night? When there are climate fires ravaging our country, when people are displaced from their homes, when hundreds die in heat domes, when people are scared to let their kids go out and play because the smoke is too dangerous to breathe. How do you sleep at night?
I appreciate your desire to create headlines, point fingers, and attempt to villainize the industry and in it. But what I would say, when you do that, you're actually attacking hundreds of thousands of Canadians nationwide that work hard each and every day to provide energy. It's the support of this country. So, you know, I'll take that. I've got thick skin. Some of your data is inaccurate, but I understand the emotion behind it. I want to get to the why we were called here today. It was to talk about profits and emissions reduction. And
my question in particular was, how do you sleep at night, given the climate crisis and your responsibility in fueling it?
Point of order,
Yes,
like
I
any
heard your-
decorum
I
around
heard
here
your
in terms
question.
of personal attacks
I don't
on
think.
individual
I think
witnesses,
to be honest,
bizarre.
I think to be honest, that's more of a rhetorical question. But I stopped the clock. But
Point of order, Chair.
Pardon?
The question was asked, and I think that you know, in a standard operating practice with committee, an approximate amount of time of a question asked versus the ability for the answer to be given. And Ms. Collins asked a question. Certainly, Mr. Kruger was starting to answer.
Mr.
And
Chair?
I think that
Wait a
it is
minute.
only appropriate and in line with the traditions of this place to allow for answers to be given.
And Mr. Couric to allow an answer to be given. What I'm saying is, I'm just making a comment that was a rhetorical question, but you know.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Ms. Collins. Nothing wrong with rhetorical questions.
It was
All
not.
is permitted.
It wasn't a rhetorical question. This was the question that we got most often from Canadians who wrote in wanting answers from oil and gas CEOs. This was their question.
Okay, well, you go ahead. I'm going to start the clock now. You go ahead, Mr. Kruger, and the floor is yours
And
to
Mr.
answer
Chair,
the question.
Mr. Chair, I believe that Mr. Kruger answered the question, then he wanted to change the topic to something else. And so if he's not wanting to answer that question in particular, I have more questions.
Okay, we didn't give him a chance to answer the question. So, Mr. Kruger, do you want to answer that question?
Actually get on the topic of the study.
I don't, quite frankly, I don't know what the criteria is for how do I sleep at night.
Yeah.
But what I do know is the tens of thousands of employees and contractors that work for us work hard each and every day to provide safe, secure, reliable energy for Canada. So other than my sleeping patterns, I don't have any other reply to that one.
Thank you. You know, we had climate-impacted Canadians come to Ottawa today and share their stories. They told us about having their homes burnt to the ground. They told us about having floods completely ruin decades of memories. They told us about their community that will soon be swept away. Farmers who have told us about the impact of the smoke on their workers, of the impacts of the climate crisis on our food systems. It is wild to me that when we are facing a climate emergency, we have the people around this virtual table raking in billions of dollars and then coming to the government and asking for more handouts. You know, why is it that you expect everyday Canadians, taxpayers, to fund the And I understand that my conservative colleagues want to protect
Collins
oil and
has the
gas
floor.
CEOs, that they feel like they need to defend them at every corner. But
Excuse me, colleagues, I'm going to stop the clock. Ms. Collins has the floor, and you know everyone has their time, and it's their time, and so I just would ask members to maybe just let the witness and the questioner speak unimpeded. Ms. Collins, go ahead.
I'm curious how it is you feel comfortable coming to the federal government asking them for more handouts when you are raking in record profits and can pay to clean up your own pollution.
Who's that to?
Mr.
Are you
Kruger.
directing that?
Yes.
Oh, I'm apparently pretty popular today. Well, if you look back, let me start on the record profits for a minute. Two of my colleagues said this, and I'll be quick so I can perhaps get my answers in. We are a global capital-intensive industry that goes with cyclic prices on a commodity. So in the last 4 years, yes, we've had a record profit year, and yes, we've had a record loss year. On average, over the last 4 years, we've made over the last 4 years, we've made $17 billion. Big numbers, big industry. In those same 4 years, we've paid $17 billion in taxes and royalties. And each and every year, we've paid an additional $8 billion in salaries, wages, and benefits to Canadians who also pay taxes. So yes, we're a big business and the numbers are big, but it goes up and down. And to characterize us as record profits, 1 year, yes. But then also remember the year that was a record loss. That's the last 4 years in the roller coaster of global oil and gas.
And I guess my question is, when you make record profits, when there are headlines that say the oil and gas sector has made more money than it's ever made before, how are Canadians supposed to trust that you will invest that in decarbonization instead of putting it into the pockets of your shareholders and in bonuses to yourselves? Because that's what we've seen. And you have been, part of the oil and gas industry for decades and part of companies who have misled Canadians for years and years. Your companies knew that there was a climate crisis. They knew that climate change was real and yet funded misinformation to try and convince Canadians that the climate crisis was not as serious as it is. Now,
on doit s'arrêter là parce que
Your time is up. We have to finish there because the first round of questions has ended. And we will start the second round of questioning with Mr. Deltel. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to your Canadian Parliament. We agree that climate change is real and we have to adapt to the changes. So we must reduce pollution and emissions. Of course, we know that the oil industry plays a major role in the economy of Canada, but also on the environmental impacts. In Quebec, we do consume oil. A recent study said that there was a 7% increase in oil consumption. As long as we will need oil, we will fight for Canadian oil. Why? Because in Canada, we have very high standards in order to respect human rights and environmental standards as well. Canada also benefits from $13 billion in equalization payments. I have some questions. I would like each of you to answer each of my questions. First, what percentage did you manage to reduce the pollution generated to produce 1 barrel of oil? It can be, we can start with Mr. Kruger.
I don't understand the context of the time frame, because I do think that it varies on the time frame and it varies by the type of production we have.
Okay, so Mr.
So I don't have a simple answer to that question.
Well, because if you produce more, obviously you have more emission. We do understand that. But if by each and every barrel you count your emission, my question is, do you reduce the emission by each barrel over the last year, over the last years?
Yeah. Thank you. And I'll be quick so my colleagues can answer. I would say right now, for example, we're the largest blender of biofuels in consumer products, diesel and gasoline. That is reducing the carbon intensity of individuals that are not only the product we produce, but they're consuming. When we're investing right now $1.7 billion to cut the emissions at an oil sands plant by cogeneration, going from coke-fired boilers to natural gas-fired boilers. That project will be complete by the end of this year, and you'll see the corresponding emissions reductions thereafter. So the activities and the money we're spending now is benefiting and reducing the carbon content of what we produce and the way our consumers use it.
And if I could comment from Imperial's perspective, I'm quite proud of the progress that we've demonstrated in reducing the emissions intensity of each barrel we produce. As I mentioned in my opening comments, from 2013 to 2016, we reduced that intensity by 20% per barrel. Since 2016 to currently, we have reduced an additional approximate 10%. And as I mentioned, we have a goal, an objective to reduce 30% by 2030. And of course, collectively, as the Pathways Alliance, we've all set objectives to work together to achieve net zero by 2050. So I'm quite proud of that progress. We are going to continue to invest, and we're very committed to this objective.
Madam Pierce.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. We are not a major oil producer in the country of Canada, but what I can share with you is that we do have Scope 1, 2, and 3 targets. And on a global basis, what I can share with you is that for Scope 1 and 2, we've reduced by close to 60% of our 50% target by 2030 from 2016 timeframe. I'd also comment that with respect to methane emissions, we've reduced that by 70% since 2016 at the end of last year. We also have a very clear commitment to continue to reduce our methane emissions to near zero by 2030. As it relates to Scope 3, as I mentioned earlier, we do have some commitments towards that. We have a commitment to reduce Scope 3, which is the emissions from our customers, by 15 to 20% by 2030. And we've also made a commitment to reduce the emissions from our oil products by 15 to 20%. Thank you.
So when we talk about reducing emission, it's a never-ending story, because if you realize that if you challenge yourself, you will have to reduce year after year after year. So my question is, what is the target today for this year to reduce emission, and how much money would you intend to invest in reduction of pollution?
On a temps d'une réponse, alors à qui vous êtes?
We're almost out of time, so who do you want answering?
Answer who?
Whoever would like to answer.
Clock is running. 3, 2, 1. Okay, we'll go to Ms.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. I listened with great interest as you all made your opening remarks. And I noted a few things. One, that John McKenzie said that the oil and gas industry is good for Canadians. Suncor CEO Richard Kruger said that we should be producing more oil in Canada because we have strong social accountability and climate action measures. And Ms. Pierce, you said that you were happy to be healthy and in good spirits and wish that we all were too. And I wanted to comment on those things because words are all fine and good, but it really depends on the context and who is listening to those words. So when you talk about the oil and gas industry and being good for Canadians, Mr. McKenzie, it really depends on how you define good. When you were speaking of it, it was all economic measurements. And I would suggest you left out a couple economic measurements, such as share prices and executive compensation. But most Canadians believe that what is good for Canadians is actually keeping global temperature increases to less than 1.5 and certainly 2 degrees Celsius. They believe that good health and economic justice is good for Canadians. And they believe that not seeing out-of-control forest fires, floods, and droughts is certainly good. Absolutely. And Indigenous people that I've spoken to also believe that we have a duty to protect our planet for the next 7 generations. So it seems that that is in a little bit of opposition to the economic good that you referenced. Additionally, the social accountability and climate action measures that you mentioned, Mr. Kruger, it's one of the reasons you're here, because it doesn't seem that the oil and gas industry is actually living up to those measures that we have in place in Canada. And with the increase in production of fossil fuels, carbon emissions have continued to increase. And the industry is against a cap on emissions, which actually would provide social accountability. And more climate action. Also against methane regulations. And all those things would help to actually ensure that Canadians believe that the social accountability and climate action we want in Canada were being met by the oil and gas industry. And lastly, Susanna, our youth are not in good spirits. I speak to many of them, and they're experiencing climate anxiety and despair, quite frankly. You know, elderly people are suffering from heat domes, poor air quality. Homeowners have seen their homes washed away, and farmers are struggling to keep their farms out with droughts. So this is a different reality than you're talking about. And I really believe that given that your emissions from the industry have increased, and you have this belief that you'll meet the goals by 2050, but we haven't seen the action. And there seems to be a lot of uncertainty about the industry actually meeting its goals for 2030 that were set, the 22 megatons. So I would like to request that every one of the companies table their specific plans and investments that they're going to be making that have been board approved to get to net zero with the 2030 interim targets, and what investments you have made and are going to make to actually reach those goals. Because while words are good, actions are better. Thank you.
Still have.
Then I'd actually like to ask about your specific commitments, every company, specific commitments that you have made on the to get to that 2020 megaton annual reduction by 2030. The investments now. I know the Pathways for Alliance has a large project. If perhaps we could start with you, Mr. Kruger. What has Suncor committed to investing as of right now to get to that target by 2030?
We publish every year an annual sustainability report and a climate report that details at length the actions we're taking, the commitments were made. And unless you want to take the rest of the time, I could read through that report.
No, I just want to know. I just want to know.
That might be a little easier.
No, I just want to know the specific investment targets you're making in CCUS right now.
In CCUS, it is around the preparation and the negotiation to determine an appropriate framework for the Pathways Alliance, carbon capture and storage. We can't do that on our own.
So you're still in discussions. You've not made any commitments to investment right now.
We can't do that on our own. We need a regulatory framework and we need the right fiscal framework to enable the competitiveness of the industry and to do it so that everybody benefits from it. So the commitments are showing up at the table each and every day with the sleeves rolled up, working hard at multiple levels of government to try to get this done.
Merci. Madame Posey.
Thank you. On to Ms. Posey for 2.5 minutes. My question is for Ms. Pierce from Shell. Of course, I mentioned this earlier. I would like to talk about the 5 megatons that were captured, 5 megatons over 5 years and produced over the same period. The $1 billion for this project were $777 million. Now on to the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. The same institute said that 13 CCS projects currently underway, well, 10 of them are underperforming or are total failures. Here's my question, Ms. Pierce. How is the capture of 1 megaton per year for an industry that produces more than 158 tons in 2022, how do you explain this?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question. As you may recall, the CCS Quest project was back in the 2010s when it began, and it was a pilot project, and it was advancing the technology. And so as a result, it was a project in which we were learning. It was a project which on its own, partly because of the financial framework and the business models that didn't exist, we had to work with government in order to make it feasible. As a result of that project, however, we now have captured 9 million tons, and that is significant because that's 9 million tons that would have otherwise been emitted. So, in fact, I believe the project has worked, and a lot of the information...
I'll stop you right there. You're saying that you have captured some carbon. In September 2022, that same institute I mentioned earlier says that 73% of the carbon that was captured was sold for the for oil, so it allows fossil fuel companies to produce even more oil. So yes, Quest captured it, but it also allowed the extraction of more oil. How is that helping in the fight against climate change? 30 seconds.
Okay, and thank you for the question. The project was really looking at how do we reduce emissions from the manufacture of oil that is still in demand, unfortunately, as a part of the overall economy. 80% of the world today still depends on fossil fuels. And so we can't shut down the existing energy system, but what we can do is use projects like CCS to decarbonize the fuels that we use today. That is what projects like Quest and other CCS projects are about.
Merci. Madame Collins.
Thank you. On to Ms. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I first want to start off by just going back to something Mr. Kruger said around the taxes that your companies pay. And this is from Canadians for Tax Fairness. They note that from 2021 to 2023, the oil and gas industry recorded $132 billion in pre-tax profits, second only to real estate in the non-financial industries. Among the 10 most profitable industries during this period, the oil and gas sector paid the lowest effective tax rate, 8%. This is because the oil and gas industry makes disproportionate use of tax credits and capital cost allowances. The industry received over $20 billion in tax credits from 2010 to 2021. It is unfortunate that our current government continues to give out huge fossil fuel subsidies, to huge tax breaks to an industry that is raking in record profits and paying an incredibly low tax rate. I also want to talk about the lobbying that is happening. There's a clear analysis that the oil and gas emissions cap proposal is already set so low that it is easily achievable if your companies simply follow through on the voluntary climate promises that you have already made. So it's pretty concerning to learn that you have been actively lobbying to undermine it. And you've also been actively lobbying against a excess profit tax on the oil and gas industry, and effectively, because we learned through the Globe and Mail that the finance minister was considering this and then backed down in the face of lobbying from your industry. So I'm curious why you can consistently try and lobby against the policies that you say you're potentially in support of because you want to get to net zero. And maybe we'll start with Mr. Kruger, and then we can go to Imperial with Mr. Corson.
Yeah, Mr. Kruger.
Sure. There was a lot for a first date in that question or statement, or I'm not exactly sure what it all was. But I think if you take it piece by piece, you referenced industry taxes and profits. I can't relate to those, but I can look at what my company has paid. And as I said, in the last 4 years, we've made $17 billion and we've paid $17 billion in taxes and royalties.
And the question was about lobbying and the emissions cap.
Unfortunately, there's no time for the answer. Ms. Goodridge?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's interesting as I sit here and reflect. My dad worked 42 years in the oil industry in Fort McMurray, and he very proudly put on steel toe boots every single day as a tradesperson to go and secure Canada's energy future. And he was very proud of that in his time at Syncrude. And he would be, I'm sure, beside himself if he could be here today to watch this. And me at this table questioning the executives. My questions are, to start, to Mr. Kruger. What is the difference in emissions per barrel at the Suncor base plant, which is the oldest operation in the oil sands, versus Fort Hills, the newest?
The materially lower at Fort Hills. I don't have the exact numbers for the two different facilities, but the technology applied to develop Fort Hills is the average barrel that produces Fort Hills is essentially the same as the average barrel in North America. So it's materially lower. New technology, much more.
Thank you. I have very little time. Could you table that with the committee, please? My next question, Mr. Corson. There's an active pilot project that's happening at the Cold Lake operation, which is in the southern part of my riding, and it's employing the enhanced bitumen recovery technology. What emission reduction does this project represent?
Yeah, thanks for the question. We have multiple pilots we're pursuing. The enhanced bitumen recovery technology has the potential to reduce emissions intensity by approximately 60%. And as I mentioned earlier, we've recently started up a new operation at Cold Lake called Grand Rapids that we expect to deliver a 40% reduction. So technology plays a very key role in our path to net zero by 2050.
Question to go all over the place. I'm sorry, but we've got very little time. Mr. McKenzie, recently your company announced a very large amount of money, $50 million, to go and help nearby Indigenous communities tackle their very serious housing crisis. Was this part of a regulatory requirement or any kind of government requirement?
So the short answer to your question is that this was done on our own volition. Now, I would like to take credit for that. And that was actually my predecessor, Alex Bourbet, who started that program. And we are delivering an immediate need to Aboriginal communities where we do business by building 200 homes over the next 5 years for that $50 million that you spoke of. We're very proud of that.
Well, and to go one further, it's beyond just building homes. You're actually also, and this is something that I'm very proud of, helping Indigenous students get the skills they need at Portage College, which is also in the southern part of my riding, located primarily in Lac-La-Biche. And this goes to show a piece of the fact that doesn't get talked about here. And I know most of the members actually around this table have gone on diatribes explaining to you guys and as a way of undressing you in some form, rather than actually ask questions. I'm very happy that we had the opportunity to have this, because these are important questions that Canadians deserve to have the answers to. So my question, I'll start to Mr. Kruger. What is your annual spend with Indigenous business each year?
Yeah, last year we spent as a total company on the order of $16 billion. 23% of that went to Indigenous companies, more than $3 billion.
Is that part of a government or regulatory requirement?
No, we do that because we think it's good business.
To Mr. Corson, the same question.
Yes, we take a lot of pride in our relationship with the Indigenous partners we have across our businesses. We've been growing that part of those relationships since 2008. We have spent a cumulative $4.6 billion with our Indigenous partners.
And same question to Mr. McKenzie.
So we too believe in investing in the communities where we do business. And I believe since 2019, we've spent about $1.4 billion with Aboriginal businesses, and since 2009, about $4.5 billion.
Okay, and now my very last question to Mrs. Hernandez. Sorry. The equity partnership with 23 Indigenous communities is groundbreaking in my community, in my region. You talked briefly about the AIOC being a success story. My good friend Justin Burke was the leader on the Athabasca corporation that led this. Why did you do this?
Malheureusement, on n'a pas le temps d'une réponse.
Unfortunately, we don't have time for the answer, so we will move on to Mr. Longfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and sincere thank you to the executives for coming into what's a difficult meeting, a difficult discussion that we're having. I've come to Ottawa from Guelph, where my youth have really charged me with not pointing fingers at other politicians, at not pointing fingers to be confrontative, but to try and work on the problem of reducing emissions. I really appreciated your framing on your discussion, Mr. Kruger. The profits and planet are not mutually independent, they're mutually dependent. But it seems from today's discussion, we're using two different measuring sticks. We're talking about emissions per barrel versus net emissions. And we need to reduce emissions as a country. And if we're not getting those net reductions from oil and gas because we're increasing production, we have to find those savings somewhere else. And we don't have any savings with the scale of oil and gas. So I think the technical challenge is, how do we decouple emissions from production? How do we reduce emissions faster than we're increasing production. Is that a fair read on the situation, Mr.
Yeah,
Kruger?
I think you framed it very well. Is that, you know, in my view, the world's going to consume a given amount of oil independent of what Canada chooses to do.
But the world aside, Canada has reduction targets